Hi, welcome back to Ways of Reading, a series of conversations from Columbia College at Columbia University about the books on the reading list of literature humanities, our first year literature seminar here in Columbia College. I'm joined today by Sophus Helle. Sophus has multiple degrees from Aarhus University, University of Copenhagen. He's currently a postdoc at Princeton and a Syriologist, a translator, a writer, and most relevantly to our interests, is the translator of both Enheduanna and Gilgamesh in the editions we will be using in literature humanities. And so I'm really grateful that Sophus has joined us today to talk about these books that we're going to be reading very soon in this class. Sophus, welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here and so delighted to be on this curriculum twice. That's a really, really huge honor, and so happy about that.
Well, it's one of the changes that this class has gone through recently is an increased interest in ancient Mesopotamian literature. For many years that was not part of our reading list, even though something like the Epic of Gilgamesh has been on great books reading lists around the country for many years. So this year we're beginning our fall semester with these two works from ancient Mesopotamia, from the cuneiform literary tradition. The poetry of Enheduanna, we're reading Enheduanna's Exaltation of Inanna, and we're reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we'll say a little bit more, I think, as we talk about what these two texts are, where they come from, the sort of difference and space between them in time. But I actually wanted to start with Enheduanna and the Exaltation of Inanna and ask you, Sophus, do you remember the first time you read this poem?
Yeah, and I really want to go back to the point that you made that like Enheduanna is a very new addition, not just to the curriculum of Lit Hum at Columbia specifically, but also just to world literature in general. And I think, there's a real sense of excitement, at least for me as a translator, that, she's now becoming part of a broader conversation because that wasn't the case just 5 years ago. Just 5 years ago, she was practically unknown outside of these very small academic circles and some feminist circles. But the combined effect of in part this book, but also very much an exhibition about Enheduanna at the Morgan Library in New York just 2 years ago has really catapulted her to a new level of fame. And what that means essentially is that so many people are reading her with fresh eyes. And that's what I find so exciting about it. That with so many of these other texts in the curriculum, they've been read and reread for thousands of years, but Enheduanna is still is still unexplored territory. There are so few people working on her. There's so few fixed formed opinions about her work. So I really think there's just so much to discover, so much to explore. And I really encourage the students to keep that in mind when they read these texts, because there is so they can really find the things in these texts that they'll be the first to find. And I saw, that's why I find it so exciting to work on her. And also just, the academic community around her is so tiny, and we also have our biases and blind spots, so outside eyes are very much welcome. But as for the first time I read her, it was the second semester I was at university, and I kind of heard about her and about her strange position as the first known author. So Enheduanna is the first she marks the first time in literary history when we can connect a literary work to a person who we can identify in the historical record. So that is what I mean when I say that she is the first known author. And I heard about her poems before I sort of actually had a chance to engage with the actual Sumerian. Now, there are these two languages that we're going to have to talk about when we talk about the ancient Near East, Sumerian and Akkadian. And these two languages, they enter this pair in the ancient world. So the cuneiform cultures, as we call them, have this twin linguistic foundations. But Sumerian and Akkadian are super different from each other. Akkadian is a Semitic language like Arabic or Hebrew, while Sumerian is what we call an isolate, which means that it's sort of this orphan language. We don't, it doesn't have any family members that we know of. It's just this sort of strange thing. And Akkadian, I think, is a wonderful language. I have to say, I much prefer Akkadian, which is what Gilgamesh is written in. It's a delightful language, very easy to learn. Whereas Sumerian is just this huge puzzle, and it continues to be a puzzle. There's no agreed upon dictionary or a grammar of Sumerian. And so, reading Enheduanna's poems is a much more daunting proposition in the original than it is to read Gilgamesh. But eventually, I was able to make my way to reading them in the original. And I really feel like a lot of the existing translations struggle so much to make sense of these poems that they really conveyed very little of their literary effect. So it was only when I was diving into the Sumerian that I really got a sense of how these poems work, which is not necessarily the case in with the existing translations of Gilgamesh. I thought that those gave a fairly accurate image of what the text is like. But the thing about Enheduanna is that you can think of her as first and foremost a religious poet. So she's sort of like Emily Dickinson, or for those, I really love Joel Manley Hopkins, or there's an ancient poet called Pindar. And what these poets have in common is that they really do crazy things with language because what they're describing is crazy to them. They're describing a divine force that really lies beyond usual language. And so they really strain and stretch language to express this inexpressible force. And that is what Enheduanna does as well. And so just, figuring out what is going on like at a very literal level in any one line is quite difficult. And so the students might want to consult a website that I created to accompany this book, enheduanna.org, and there they'll just find a breakdown of every single line in the exaltation, where I just sort of go through the problems of like, what is this line about?
Hmm.
But weirdly, it was almost easier to make a poetic translation, right? Like a free translation, because, sometimes the poetic effect of the line is quite clear, even if it's deliberately obscure and deliberately difficult to understand, because it is addressing a goddess that is deliberately difficult and obscure to understand.
Can you maybe we could look at some text and just get a sense of what is the texture or the feel of Enheduanna's poetry that creates this effect you're talking about?
So I think one of the key elements in creating there are two key elements I would say that create this effect. One is at the oral level, so there's just a lot of like these poems. They don't rhyme, they don't have a fixed rhythm, but there's a lot of like wordplay, a lot of alliteration, a lot of assonance, which I then try to recreate in my translation because I think like a translation that doesn't recreate that aspect of Enheduanna is just going to leave you confused, right? Because so much of it is that the poem is bound together by the way it sounds. But the other thing that it does is that it really just hurls metaphor after metaphor at you. It's like a blizzard of images that describe this awe-inspiring goddess, Inanna. And so just for the record, like just to get things clear, Inanna is the Sumerian name for the goddess who is called Ishtar in Akkadian. And so we're gonna meet her again in Gilgamesh in a very different form, but it is the same goddess, Inanna and Ishtar. Um, and so that's what I find so stunning about these poems, the way it's just image after image. So if we read here from the Exaltation, we can read, as if you were a basilisk, you poured poison upon the enemy, as if you were the storm god, grain bends before your roar. You are like a flash flood that gushes down the mountains. You are supreme in heaven and earth. You are Inanna. Raging rainfall of fire, it was An, the sky god, who gave you power. You are a queen astride a lion. You give orders by the holy order of An. Who can fathom the great duties that befall you? It is you who strikes down the enemy, you who gives the storm its strength. Enlil, another of the major gods, loves you for teaching the land how to fear. An has ordered you to stand by for battle. So again, here we've got the rainfall of fire, we've got these lions that she rides on, we had her as a basilisk, we had her as a storm god, and so on and so forth. And the text just really keeps going on like this. And like as a reader, you are disoriented. And that is what I think you're meant to be.
It's interesting to think about how this poetry works differently from, say, the poetry of Homer, which we'll
Mhm.
read a few weeks later. I'm thinking about, in the Iliad, the poet will describe one of the heroes, like Menelaus, as moving around the battlefield like a lion.
Yeah,
And this is a common feature we talk about as the Homeric simile. Um,
yeah,
and this is not a poetic voice that says you are like a lion. It
yeah,
says you are a queen
yeah,
astride a lion.
absolutely.
And this, it seems to me there's this series of just declarative statements about what she is that are all she can't be all of these things, and yet the point is that she is somehow all of these things. And the only way to express that is this sort of succession, this barrage of images that try to articulate something about the divine that essentially can't be articulated.
Yeah, and fundamentally, Inanna slash Ishtar is the goddess of change and contradiction and multiple poles and opposites and paradox. So it makes good sense for her to use literary form to say, oh, you were this, you were that. And in another of the great hymns to Inanna that was attributed to Enheduanna, there is this long list of like contradictory attributes that is given to Inanna, that she is, the goddess of power, but also of failure, of victory, but also defeat, that she's the goddess of turning men into women and women into men, strength into weaklings, and so on and so forth. So, this, as you say, this barrage of declarative statements is a good form for her, but it is also just fundamentally the form of the hymn, right? And I think Gilgamesh, being an epic, is much closer to the Iliad in a sort of poetic texture. It is much more focused on this narrative flow, which will include similes, but where there's a clear separation between what is the level of metaphor and what is the level of reality, whereas in Enheduanna is much more, as a hymn, it's much more about blurring that. And I think one of the ways we can think about the difference is there's a theorist, a literary theorist called Jonathan Culler, who makes this point that like there's a difference between a poem describing an event and a poem aiming to be an event. And in
Mm.
Enheduanna's hymns are very much in the latter category. And that is also how the poems depict themselves. Enheduanna and the Exaltation depicts this desperate situation in which she's been cast into exile, and there's a rebel leader that has taken over her city, and so on and so forth. And this is a poem that intervenes in its own story because
Mm.
she prays to Inanna so that Inanna can come help her and oust this rebel and reinstate her as high priestess. And so, the poem thinks of itself as doing something to the world, which is not necessarily the case in Gilgamesh, at least not in that way. It's a
Yeah.
more ambivalent relation between literature and reality.
Yeah,
And
this
also
is
just one
yeah.
final thing I think is so interesting, and we can get on to this more, but Menelaus might be compared to a lion, but it's interesting that Gilgamesh would be compared to a lioness. He's often gendered female in his metaphors, but that's we can get back to that later.
Yeah, we should come back to that when we get to Gilgamesh. I just want to draw out one thread of what you've been saying about the poetry and the experience of reading it and the experience of translating it. One of the things we talk about doing in this class is really learning how to read,
Yeah,
how to sit down with a piece of poetry, with a piece of literature, and begin to make sense of it for ourselves.
yeah,
And if I'm understanding you correctly, if we as readers, as new readers, new to this text, new to this class, if we're reading this poetry and we're not quite sure what it means or what it's trying to say, sounds like you're not entirely sure at any particular moment, like what
yeah.
it might be trying to say either.
Absolutely. And I think there are at least two things going on here. I suspect that I'm going to think of a third as I answer your question, but there are at least two things going on here. First, there is this like deliberately obscure poetic style, and I think I'm just going to mention two brief examples of this like deliberate ambivalence. One is that the word for enemy and the word for country and the word for mountain are all the same. And Enheduanna is often like just running roughshod across those meanings, in part because there was this myth of the time that Inanna got angry at a mountain because the mountain didn't bow down before her, which is also just a great mental image. And so she just absolutely destroys this mountain. And so destroyer of the enemy also just means destroyer of the mountain. And it can be quite like Enheduanna is definitely not interested in clarifying which of these she means at any one point. She wants to keep them all in your mind at the same time. And another line I just loved. So this is one of the very, very last lines of the Exaltation. The Exaltation ends with this little like invocation, final invocation in the last couple of lines. But the line just before that, effectively the last line of the narrative, is what she said to her holy woman was magnificent. And the word that is being used there for holy woman, it's a long Sumeriological discussion. I'm not going to go into it, but it could refer either to Enheduanna or to Inanna. And I think it's deliberate. You know what I mean? Like it's very much you're meant to say, oh, this could be Enheduanna's poem to Inanna that was magnificent, but it could also be Inanna's order in reply that Enheduanna be reinstated as high priestess. That was magnificent. You're meant to be able to see this, read this line one way or another. And those are the deliberate ambivalences. But then there's all the like layers of doubt that have been piled on just by the distance and time and the way that this text has been preserved. You know, Sumerian is not just a dead language, it's a very dead language. Like say it's doubly dead. Because you know, we have it dies out around year 2000 BCE and then keeps being used, much like Latin in Europe, for about 2000 years after that. So, you know, it's like it's a very dead language. It's this isolate, and you know, the texts are preserved in these student copies. And you know, you might hear more about that from Gina Konstantopoulos, who'll talk to you in a future lecture. But these student copies, you know, they do contain mistakes. Like every text under the sun contains mistakes, you know? So there are these layers and layers that we have to go through to access the text. And just, you know, and the discipline, the field that is engaged in that work of like trying to piece together the text is what's known as philology. And like, you know, you have these layers that, you know, you have the manuscripts themselves, which, you know, thousands of years old, made by these students who sometimes make mistakes. Then you have the level of philology, then you have the level of translation, you know, and all of this adds to a sense of like we're all trying to work together to carry this text across time and to make sense of it in different ways, but you know, also in different ways. It made different sense then than it does today, and that's just an inevitable part of it.
Yeah, this is something that I really enjoy about your translations as someone who doesn't read Sumerian or Akkadian, but who is a philologist is I think that the way that you have made the text available to us, um, and your great introductory essays, I encourage the students to read all of the essays that come with the text as well. But the way you present the text to us, I think both makes it accessible, but also conveys the sense in which you are sort of part of this chain of attempts to make sense of it, and invites each of us to kind of be the next person in this chain. And I think that that is
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I wanted.
oh, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that is the kind of collaborative spirit that I hope our students will sort of bring to this. So, you know, to come back to something I was saying before and to speak to my students now, if you're reading this and thinking, I don't know what this means, there's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah, no,
It's
absolutely.
strange, it's hard, it's also kind of powerful, but most importantly, like we need you, your classmates need you. You know, we're all working together as readers, always to make sense of the texts before us. You
Yeah, and just like yeah, before we move on, like I also note this in the introductory essays of Gilgamesh, but it's as true for Enheduanna that these texts are texts that are super old and super new. You know, just to bring it back to that point I started with, like these are super fresh, and like in 10 years we'll know much more about these texts. In
yeah,
part because there are people like the students here today that are reading them and making new sense of them. You know, so if you're confused by them, like everybody is, but
yes,
also anything that you think about them is in a sense valuable and is in a sense part of this ongoing discovery. And just to like flag how the text itself announces that, you know, so Enheduanna's exaltation is important in the history of authorship, not just because it's a first text that can be linked to a person who can be identified in the historical record, but also because it describes a moment of authorship in its own climax, you know? So we have this very powerful passage where it says, "For you I have given birth to it," that is to the poem. "What I sang to you at dead of night, let a lamenter repeat at midday." So already in that moment of authorship, there is an awareness that this text has to be carried out by another person, the
yeah,
lamenter, who sort of takes on the text, you
yeah,
know? And in that moment in Enheduanna goes from being an I to being a her. So there's
yeah,
a sense that the text sort of leaves her behind because you know it has to
right.
be carried across time if it is to circulate. And so
It's
that's
it
inherently the nature of texts.
Yeah, it's almost a moment not just of authorship but of publication, right?
Yeah,
In
right.
which the this writer says, "Look, this was a private prayer, this was a private song, and now I'm handing it on to someone else." And
Yeah,
everyone else who brings it to life again will be doing something that's both different from the moment when I originally sang it, and yet is part of what it is.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so that's, I think, a good transition into just to like get our bearings here, because you've
Yeah,
mentioned the antiquity of both Enheduanna's work and Gilgamesh. You mentioned how very dead a language Sumerian is, and even the Epic of Gilgamesh, unless I'm mistaken, it's only been possible to read it for a couple hundred years, right? For
Yeah, it
moderns.
celebrated the 150th birthday a couple of years ago,
Amazing,
which is
amazing.
a great day.
So, sometimes the books we read in a class like this, people will describe them as classics, and that's a word
Mm,
that means lots of things. Like I'm in the classics department, which just means
yeah,
Greek and Latin. But in this case, I think it means something like a book that has been read for a long time and studied for a long time and has had a big impact on the people who've read it. And with some of the stuff we read, like Homer or Dante, we can look to history and the history of literature and the history of manuscripts and see, what, basically since these texts were created, lots of
yeah,
people have been reading them and engaging with them. Um, but we have, with this cuneiform tradition, we have a break, right?
yeah.
Where for a couple thousand years now, no one's been able to read these. And yet my sense is that prior to that break, they were already classics of that antiquity
Yeah.
in their own world. Can you say a little bit about that and about sort of these texts as literature and as classics in this sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is such a key part of the history of cuneiform cultures. And one of the ways in which Enheduanna and Gilgamesh really differ from pretty much I want to say all of the other texts on the Litham curriculum. I don't have them all in my mind right now, but there is this strange gap, right? Like you have centuries of continuity of reading and rereading these texts, then a long break, and then again a modern explosion, which again contributes to the sense of like doubled oldness and newness that I was talking about before.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, yeah, I want to say two things about the classics. One is more like what one I guess is more academic and the other one is a little more personal. I think the academic perspective on the classics is just that I think part of what makes a classics is the institution that teaches it, right? Like Lithum is an institution, Columbia is an institution, and so the texts on the Lithum curriculum are classics, right? Almost by definition. And it is the same with Gilgamesh and Enheduanna in their own time. They are classics in the ancient world, in very large part because they are tied to the school curriculum. And that's also just why they survive, right? Like we have them today because they were written on tablets made of clay. And as I've already alluded to, they are written on clay by these students who, for whom this is like part of their education even back then. The students would memorize these texts and then copy them out for the teacher to inspect. And it is their position in that curriculum that really makes them classics. And so at one point, it's difficult to say when exactly, but give or take the 16th century BCE, Enheduanna falls out of the curriculum. And so she is just forgotten. The moment that she no longer has the institutional scaffolding, she stops being a classic as well. And so she is forgotten. And Gilgamesh is sort of the same. It is tied to the institutions of cultural power in its time in order to be a classic. And I think both texts kind of reflect that. It's a little more straightforward to see in Gilgamesh than in Enheduanna. But in Gilgamesh, this is in large part a poem that is, among many other things, about the importance of knowledge, the importance of history, the importance of commemoration, but also the importance of good advice. And there's this word in Akkadian, milku, which means good advice, and it really pops up in very interesting places. Also can be translated counsel. And the text, like the epic, makes really clear that like anytime a king does not listen to his counselors or to advice from other people, terrible things happen, which incidentally is the same message as Game of Thrones. Like if you go into it, it's the same thing. It happens again
Right,
and again in Game of
right.
Thrones. Like George R. R. Martin really learned the same lesson from history as Gilgamesh, but
Mm.
setting that aside, like so and that's a really convenient lesson for these students who will go on to become counselors and advisors and whose craft is history, whose craft is commemoration, whose craft is wisdom. So the text itself really shows its institutional affiliation, if that makes sense. There are also ways in which Enheduanna does this, but it's a little more of a nitty-gritty discussion I'm not going to go into now. But the other thing I was going to say about classics is just like the way I think about classics is, if you're at a party and there's a person that, you've heard about them, there's this sort of aura of importance about them, either because they hold some sort of power or just because they're cool in some way. And there's a certain sense of diffidence in going up to them. That's I think what the classics do. They're these like centers of social gravity just in the
Mm.
curriculum instead of like at a party. And I, as a person who have no shame, have never had shame going up to the classics or to people at a party. And I really encourage the same approach to these texts. These are the word classics can also create this weird like distance. It can create a sense of importance that I think can be good for these texts, but it also can create a sense of diffidence that I think can actually harm these texts a lot. And so, be shameless in your approach to the classics would be my advice.
I mean, what our students will already know if they've visited campus, or what they'll see as soon as they get here to move in, is you walk across the middle of campus, and up way at the top of our main library in giant letters are the names of Greek and Roman authors. There's Homer and Plato. And as someone who studies these authors, I think that's great. It's very cool to like walk to work every day under this giant billboard for what I do. And yet I also think every day, like, wow, that's intimidating. Like that
Yeah,
is the uh
right.
I definitely feel like I'm supposed to know who that is.
Yeah, right.
And
I remember that. I walked into the Columbia campus with us and was like, "Oh, Demosthenes. Oh wait, which one's that?" Right?
right,
It's like, "Oh,
because
really?"
because we should say there's names up there that were once canonical, and now only Greek
Yeah,
students read them.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
there's authors that are essential to our Lit Hum class who've never been up there on the wall
Yeah,
of the library. So that thing is very much an artifact of the canon at
yeah,
one particular moment in history. And this is the thing I always say about canons, is that they're always moving. They're always sort of
yeah,
locally specific. They're always kind of subjective and contingent. But I
yeah,
hope that for our students, um, like you were talking about how for the last few years, Enheduanna has suddenly sort of emerged into consciousness. One of my hopes is that actually it will be a good way for us all to start together encountering someone about whom there is not yet an aura, you know?
yeah.
Um,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
no, I totally agree with that.
so I want to talk a little bit about Gilgamesh now, and you've already alluded to the way that one of the things that makes Enheduanna significant. So her poetry is fantastically old, and yet still has attached to it an author's name that we can sort of locate in history.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Gilgamesh, can you give us a sense of where the Gilgamesh text comes out of relative to that? Does it have a clear genesis? Does it have authors associated with it? Or is it more like Homer, where it kind of coalesces out of an older tradition that we can only barely glimpse?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's it's a bit of a tricky question, but I'm gonna try my best to like navigate us through it. So, okay, just to start with Enheduanna before we move on to Gilgamesh, like Enheduanna is 100% a real person, unlike Homer or unlike the author that later
Right.
gets slapped onto Gilgamesh.
And
She's 100% real.
let me just
We
say
know,
we've got a bunch of great videos on Homer. Students can
yeah.
can get more into the Homer authorship question. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 for sure. But so we know she existed, we know she was the daughter of this great emperor and so on and so forth. But it is also possible that these texts were written later in her name after her death, kind of as the ancient equivalent of historical fiction. But it is also very possible that they were written by her. And like scholars have gone back and forth, and there's not really any solid evidence anyway. But the problem there is that Enheduanna lives around 2300 BCE, and the manuscripts of the poems by the students I was mentioning are from like 1700 BCE. So she is sort of distributed in time in this kind of like stark way, right? Like this period and this period. Whereas with Gilgamesh, you have like a long, long, long continuity of the text changing and changing and changing and changing over time. So it's not like just two periods, but you really get the sense of continuity. And the earliest versions of Gilgamesh's story in the Sumerian language are about 2 centuries after Enheduanna. And then the Akkadian epic, which is when the story is sort of like knitted together into one composition, is sometimes in the early second millennium BCE, let's say 1800, but that's really just a number, who knows? And then it goes through these progressive changes and redactions and versions over the next couple of centuries. And then around 1100 BCE, it reaches this final form that we call the Standard Babylonian form. And that's not because the version is standard, it's because the language is called Standard Babylonian. It's like a dialect of the Akkadian language. So a lot like Homeric Greek is this very like literary language. It wasn't actually spoken by anybody anywhere. It's just this a literary construction. And so that's Standard Babylonian. And so the Standard Babylonian version then begins to circulate and becomes the final form of the epic, if you will. And then later, there's this period in Assyrian history where they suddenly really start to care about authors, which they hadn't before. At this point, Enheduanna is long forgotten, but they sort of reinvent the notion of authorship, having invented it once, then forgotten it. They sort of reinvent it again, and then they slap the name Sinleke Unenni onto Gilgamesh. The more I think about it, the more I don't think he's real. But some of my colleagues think he's real, and like I don't really have evidence one way or another. But yeah, I'm convinced that he's a fiction of these Assyrian scholars' imagination.
It's striking to me just how much like you've talked about this. I just want to draw it out for our students. And because I'm recording this in Manhattan, I've got a siren behind me. I hope it's not cutting into my audio. But
It's the classic New York experience.
this is New York podcasting, baby. The it's so striking to me the way that both of these texts come, as you say, out of a tradition of schools and
Yeah.
students and
Yeah.
teachers, the way that these languages are kind of, when these texts are being studied, in some cases, the language has already been dead for a while. The stories have already been very old. And, when I first started studying Greek and Latin literature, one of the things that really struck me was this sense of like, how long these traditions are that kind of tend this eternal flame,
Yeah. Yeah.
and this, we talked about the collaborative chain of interpretation, and there's also just the kind of collaborative community over time of sometimes it's veneration and sometimes it's just kind of like keeping the thing alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Gilgamesh is very self-aware about that.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways in which it is like already very early in the prologue. I think Gilgamesh, one of the dangers of reading Gilgamesh today is that you can very easily see Gilgamesh as a Babylonian, right? So this is a Babylonian in a story by the Babylonians. But that's actually not the case. The Babylonians are telling a story about a person that they saw as much, much more ancient than them, like
Right.
3,000 years ago, right?
Right.
So this is a 3,000-year-old story about a guy who lived 3,000 years ago.
Right.
And so you're meant to feel that sense of temporal distance. So, for example, at one point, Enkidu, this wild man, comes and interrupts Gilgamesh trying to exert what's called the droit de seigneur, or the jus prima noctis, which is like Gilgamesh having sex with a bride on her wedding night as king. Um, and there's a great, like, I don't know if you've seen Mel Brooks, Men in Tights. There's a great scene about that. Anyway,
Yeah.
but the point is that that's meant to be an end to this custom, right? So that is a myth of earlier times that never actually happened. It didn't happen in medieval Europe. It didn't happen in ancient Mesopotamia. It was always a myth about what the barbaric times that had come before.
Right.
And Gilgamesh puts an end to it because, that custom was thought to have ended 3,000 years ago. And then you really have to remember that sense of temporal distance. And then Gilgamesh travels even further back into time because he seeks out his ancestor, the immortal sage Utnapishti, who
Right.
tells him the story of the flood. And then, that's 10,000 years before Gilgamesh, you know what I mean? So, like, you get these layers and layers and layers of history.
Yeah.
And that becomes Gilgamesh's great triumph in the epic because the flood destroyed all records because it, destroyed everything. So it destroyed all records of the past and it killed everybody. So the only way to access the past before the flood and to learn the secret of the flood itself is to seek out this one man, Utnapishti, who Gilgamesh is the first to seek out.
Mhm.
And so Gilgamesh really reestablishes the link to the deep past. I mean, we were talking about this keeping the flame alive. In this case, it's like a tiny, tiny flickering flame. And he then takes the spark
Yeah.
and brings it back to Uruk. And that's what he is celebrated for in the prologue. The prologue describes him as the guy who discovered a secret, revealed a hidden matter, and brought home a story from before the flood. There's no mention of these like triumphs in battle or
Oh,
whatever. Like, this is what he is famous for, reestablishing that link that eventually takes him back all the way to the beginning of time. So he overcomes the
yeah.
separation that the flood imposed. And if I
Yeah.
can just say one last thing about it, the first, like Utnapishti eventually tells him the story of the flood, and the first sentence in that story is a description of the city of Shuruppak. That city was old. So even then, right, like, we've traveled far and far and far and far, and then we get all the way back to the beginning, we're told, oh, the city was already old. So
Yeah.
the Gilgamesh really tries to create the sense of historical vertigo.
Yeah. There's a that one of the things that strikes me every time I read Gilgamesh, and I think it comes out very profoundly in your translation, is um, uh, Gilgamesh has this very close relationship with Enkidu, and
Mm,
Enkidu dies, right? And Gilgamesh becomes aware that he might die.
yeah,
And if I follow correctly, this is what sends him initially to go find Utanapishti, who
yeah,
is this ancient man, the man who survived the flood, um, uh, because he wants to learn from Utanapishti how to become immortal, how to
yeah,
not die. And instead, what he gets at the end of that quest is the knowledge that death is part of the human experience,
yeah,
right? That's
mhm,
not possible. Um, you know, so he thinks he's looking for one thing and he gets something else. And then again, as you say, like Gilgamesh, everyone, I get the sense that like in Babylon, everyone knows the stories of all the monsters he killed and the quests he goes on. But
yeah,
what is the thing that's the real triumph according to the poem? It's it's getting the knowledge at the end.
yeah,
This is making me think of a poem we're going to read later in the semester, Virgil's Aeneid,
yeah,
which starts out saying, here's the great story of how Aeneas founded the city of Rome.
yeah,
And you think you're going to get something triumphant and
yeah,
victorious. And
yeah,
instead, what you get is something that's very ambivalent and
yeah,
very dark, and terrible
yeah,
things happen. And you never get, by the end of the poem, you never get to the founding of Rome. And instead, you
yeah,
get this very kind of dark act of murder in the closing lines of the poem. So anyway, this is just making me
yeah,
think about one of the things that the scope of epic can do with the expectations we bring from our knowledge of mythology is
yeah,
like we might think that the story is going somewhere, or we might think
yeah,
that the hero is great for one thing that he does, and then we can find out at the end that it's something else, right? So even in the Iliad, we meet Achilles as this guy with this superhuman rage and this superhuman killing power, and the actual denouement, the actual resolution at the end is to recognize his shared humanity
yeah,
with Priam.
yeah.
I don't know. Is this making sense in terms of
No, it
like,
makes a lot of sense. And I think that ambivalence is actually really key to a lot of these epics, right? Like, I think a lot of people come to the epic genre with an idea that it's old and dusty and kind of simple because it's just like stories about men being great and whatever. And that's not the epic genre as I know it at all. I feel like the epic genre is so ambivalent and like it often sets up the hero just to like take them down all the
yeah,
more savagely, you know? And like I think Gilgamesh, for example, we're promised in the opening lines this like super burly guy who's like as big as a bull and whatever. And like, he spends a lot more time like crying and hugging his friend than he does actually fighting, you know? So like, first of all, there's just an expectation around masculinity that isn't
yeah,
like what you think it is. It's
yeah,
a very like I don't even setting aside the question of the exact nature of the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, it feels like a very gay epic, right? It's very emotional, very, so there's that aspect of it. But it's also like this is as a lot of epics do, they build up just to tear down, you know? The first half of Gilgamesh is about love between these two heroes. It's about triumphs in battle. It's about building a name for oneself. And the second half is about death and loss and grief and failures and promises that go unfulfilled, you know? And I think that is a lot in across all the epic genre. It really is meant to leave you with a sense of like deep ambivalence.
yeah,
And I think that the strongest sense of Gilgamesh's ambivalence as an epic are the final lines, because you can read those in so many different ways. You can out of the epic feeling like he didn't get what he wanted because he failed to become immortal. You can leave the epic thinking, oh, he did get what he wanted in a sense because he achieved literary immortality. And you can leave the epic
yeah,
sensing, yeah, but like he at the same time became so passive and so inert
yeah,
because he now will just become a story that others will tell,
yeah,
and like literary immortality is good, but it's not great, you know what I
yeah,
mean? And I really think the epic is meant to get you to feel the ambivalence of the literary form itself. Yes, it is fantastic that Gilgamesh lives on as a story, even though he wanted to live on in body. But what does it mean to live on in stories? These stories are these things that are so amazing and
yeah.
yet so hollow. They're
That
so they're like clay. You can do anything with it, but it's also just clay. And
and
at one point it says about the afterlife that that's where you eat clay.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of an image of where Gilgamesh ends up. Like he's kind of just eating clay because he's only living on in the form of these like clay tablets.
This is something that I think Virgil knew when Aeneas goes to the underworld and he sees the
Yeah.
shade of Achilles, and he says, "Oh, Achilles, you were the greatest. We all know
Yeah.
your stories. We all know." And Achilles says, "I would give it all. I would give
Yeah.
it all up if I could see
Yeah.
my son again." You know,
Yeah.
and that's a I think that this tension and this ambivalence, you must be right that it's always come with the form. Can I ask you just quickly, because our students will respond, I think often to the intensity of the relationship between
Yeah.
Achilles and Patroclus, and there's a lot we can say about that relationship. But as you were translating, in this age, in the
Yeah.
2020s, and as you were reading the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which does seem to have so much kind of vibrant queer potential to it, how did you
Yeah.
think about what that relationship means today to modern readers?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just briefly got back to the underworld thing. I
Oh
think that's
yeah, sure.
one of the things as the students that you guys really have to look forward to. That like there are so many of the texts that you are reading over the next year that is about going down into the underworld. It
Isn't
just
that
really
amazing?
one of the great themes of the Lit Hum curriculum is like going down into the underworld.
Yeah.
What happens there? What does it feel like? So like I'm just leaving that there to think about. Really is going to be a repeat experience. But the as for like this relation, yeah, I mean, like I really think a lot of things could be said about it. First of all, it is, the discussion about the exact nature of their relationship is just super old. I think it's worth noting that the first use of the word homosexual about the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is 15 years after the invention of the word homosexual in the English language, right? Which tells you like how, this was debated right from the start. And I also think that the word queer is so much more helpful because there is an ambivalence and an openness, and the word queer can contain so many different things, and I think that is what Gilgamesh and Enkidu's relationship is like. I think it is left very powerfully underdetermined, and I think that's kind of why it works. It's really hard to say what exactly is their relationship, and I think it's meant to be that way. I was talking about how there's a lot of like deliberate ambiguities in Enheduanna. I think there's a lot less deliberate ambiguities in Gilgamesh, but I think they are there. And there's also these ambiguities about like Utnapishti, the flood hero, like what did he know at what time? Is he tricking people? Is he not tricking people? So there are ambiguities. But one of the great ones is like, what exactly is this relationship? And so just to give you two examples of like why I think it's so like deliberately left open, the heroes never say to each other, I love you, but they say, I loved him either before they meet or after Enkidu has died, right? So, like, during the time itself is left undescribed, but it's described sort of from the outside. And when they are both alive and when they are friends, they never use each other's name.
Yeah.
Other characters call them Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and they call other characters by name. But when talking to each other, they only say Ibri, which means my friend. And that sort of creates this sense that at one point it actually becomes quite hard to tell them apart. In the beginning of Tablet 5, when they go into the cedar forest, there's a series of speeches between them where it's like, it's not actually fully clear who's talking because they've just gone into this my friend. And they just sort of meld together. And then the very first word that Gilgamesh says after Enkidu dies is Enkidu, and that breaks
Mm.
my heart every time I read it. It's just saying like and that sort of goes also to explain then why he makes that psychological transition from grieving to fearing for his own death. Because he has identified so much with Enkidu that for them they're basically the same person, right?
Right.
And so at one point when Enkidu dies, he immediately thinks, I shall die too.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, Sophus, I think this is a great place to end, but I'm so grateful for all the time you've given us today to talk about this, and I'm grateful to you for these translations that have
They
made
were they
these
were fun to make. I
excellent.
hope they're fun to read.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I'm sure our students are going to enjoy reading them. So we're reading The Exaltation of Inanna from your collection of the poetry of Enheduanna, and we're reading your translation of the epic of Gilgamesh, which students should be getting very soon.
Hey,
Sophus Helle, thank you so much.
thank you.